Welcome to Brownfields 101, Addressing Environmental Issues at Historic Properties. My name is Rebecca Oddie. I'm the statewide Brownfield coordinator at the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. In this two-part series, we'll talk about the Brownfield program and how it can help facilitate the reuse of vacant and underutilized historic properties throughout Louisiana. This presentation, which is part one of two, will give you an overview of the Brownfields program, go over the environmental process, and talk about how the Brownfields Act addresses liability concerns. In part two, we'll talk about how to access brownfield resources for your redevelopment project. To give you a little background on me, I graduated from Valparaiso University with a degree in civil engineering. And after a couple of years in the Peace Corps, I worked as an environmental consultant in California before moving to New Orleans in 2003 to pursue a master's degree in urban and regional planning at the University of New Orleans. While I was there, I interned at the Regional Planning Commission for the New Orleans metro area. They had recently been awarded a Brownfield grant and were just getting their Brownfield program started. So after I graduated from UNO, I came on full-time to manage the program, which included overseeing environmental assessments, applying for and managing grant funding, conducting community outreach, and coordinating with development partners to facilitate brownfield projects. In December of 2018, I transitioned over to LDEQ to manage the statewide Brownfield program. I work with Jennifer Schatzel, who provides technical assistance for brownfield projects, and Dwayne Wilson, who started the program back in the 90s. He tried to retire, but he agreed to come back as our Brownfields advisor so we can still tap into his institutional knowledge. My current role at LDEQ involves providing information on brownfield resources, facilitating brownfield projects, and supporting local brownfield programs. On a personal note, I've been a longtime supporter of historic preservation and love seeing historic properties find new life. And I'm really excited that the Brownfields program kind of brings together two of my passions, restoring historic buildings and improving the environment. So what do we all have in common? Everyone who's listening in on this presentation has a part to play in the reuse of vacant and abandoned properties. We want to take the properties on the left side of the screen and move them over to the right side. Often these properties have environmental concerns that need to be addressed either before or in conjunction with the redevelopment, which is where the Brownfield program can help. First off, let's talk about the definition of a brownfield site. I've heard a lot of people in the real estate community say, I don't work on brownfield sites. But when we dig a little deeper, it turns out they do. They just don't really know it. So basically, a brownfield site is a vacant or underutilized property where environmental concerns, whether those are documented or perceived, inhibit the reuse of the property. So the Brownfields program is designed to support planning, environmental assessment, and cleanup activities to facilitate the reuse of these properties. There's no official Brownfields designation in Louisiana, so if it meets that definition, vacant and underutilized, environmental concerns prohibiting development, you can call it a brownfield site. Examples of brownfield sites include historic vacant buildings, which may have lead or asbestos, underground storage tanks that were associated with boilers or heating oil, what we call avian fecal matter from birds that have gotten into the building, abandoned gas stations, which might have underground storage tanks, or contamination from auto repair facilities. Oddly vacant lot, that includes vacant corner lots on key intersections that have been vacant for a while. Good chance those were old gas stations that have some issues. Or sites like this one that just looked like an open field. A church purchased it and then found out the former nearby asbestos plant provided asbestos tailings to the former owner to fill in the low spots of the site. So those needed to be addressed before it could be redeveloped. School buildings that are no longer being used, vacant industrial properties, and abandoned houses can also be brownfield sites. Just note that they are only eligible for brownfield funding if they are redeveloped as part of an initiative that's going to benefit the community as a whole. So something that's like an affordable housing initiative, including several different properties. Sometimes people, especially owners, have a negative connotation with the word brownfield. They assume it means that the property is being labeled as heavily contaminated or that calling it a brownfield will devalue the property. I prefer to think of them as sites that have a lot of potential, but need a little love to get there, which pretty much describes most historic properties in need of redevelopment. Normally, sites that are brownfields are already in kind of rough shape, and being called a brownfield can actually open up funding opportunities to help facilitate the reuse. But if someone is still hesitant to use the term, you might call it a potential brownfield instead, which might mitigate some of the concerns about labeling it as contaminated. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the Brownfield program, specifically how are brownfield sites created. So after some severe and highly publicized environmental issues in the 1960s and 70s, environmental laws were put in place to help prevent future environmental disasters, including the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. That was in 1980, and it's better known as CERCLA. So CERCLA created a trust fund for emergency cleanups. That's more commonly referred to as the Superfund program. And while this addressed sites with major environmental problems, it also created liability concerns for smaller scale projects that had environmental issues, but they didn't really qualify as Superfund, like abandoned gas stations, vacant buildings, that type of thing. So basically, anyone who could be connected with the property was automatically in the chain of liability for any contamination that might be found. And this created a significant amount of blight because lenders and developers were wary of taking on these sites that had unknown environmental risk, and they were at risk of being held liable for a cleanup without knowing how much that was going to cost. Obviously, this also impacted communities by reducing tax revenue, property taxes, the number of businesses and jobs available, and also potentially exposing the surrounding community to environmental concerns that were left unaddressed. So the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Brownfield program was started in the late 1990s and was codified with the 2002 Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfields Revitalization Act, which I kind of shortened to Brownfields Act. This addresses concerns related to environmental liability and unknown environmental risk. The goal of the Brownfields Act is to facilitate the reuse of sites that don't qualify as Superfund sites but have environmental issues that need to be addressed in order to be redeveloped. As a federally funded program, it is an investment of taxpayer dollars, so the redevelopment should benefit the community as a whole. For example, something that will generate income and therefore property and sales tax revenue for the municipality, something that's going to generate jobs for the community, or something that's a community benefit, such as a park, community center, library, or affordable housing. Let's be honest, pretty wide net, and I think most historic property redevelopment projects are going to meet one or more of those criteria for brownfield funding. The Brownfields Act addressed liability concerns by creating liability protections for bona fide prospective purchasers. So someone could document the environmental concerns at a property before taking ownership of the site, and then when they do take ownership of the site, they are no longer part of the chain of liability for state and federal regulatory agencies. So this made it possible for banks to loan on a property without being worried about being liable for the contamination. Obviously, that opens up a lot of funding for these sites. And like I mentioned, a note on the liability protection: while it means that the state and or federal regulatory authority won't hold you liable for past contamination, it doesn't mean that the site can necessarily be put back into commerce with addressing the contamination, which is where the next part of the Brownfields program comes in. The Brownfield program also addresses concerns about unknown environmental conditions by providing environmental assessments and cleanup plans, as well as funding for environmental remediation. So we'll talk more about the specific funding opportunities in part 2, but right now let's talk about what makes the site a good candidate for brownfield assistance. So while the property might meet the definition of a brownfield site, there are additional considerations for a site to receive assistance through the Brownfields program. So remember, it is an investment of taxpayer dollars, so your money. So we want to make sure that it's going to sites that have a good chance of showing a return on that investment for the community. As I mentioned before, the site needs to be vacant or underutilized. There's no real specific timeline for how long it needs to be abandoned, so in general, kind of use your common sense. It shouldn't have been vacated recently, and tenants should definitely not be kicked out in order to make it eligible. I've actually had people ask me that. The program is really geared towards properties that have been vacant for a while and would otherwise stay vacant if not for the Brownfields assistance. Good candidates for the Brownfield program also have a flexible timeline. Brownfields assistance, it does not move quickly. I once had to tell someone we were working with that he either had to give up his timeline or his sanity when working with Brownfields. He really couldn't have both. Since it is federal funding, there are additional checks and balances in place to make sure that it's properly spent, which can impact the timeline, especially when the funding is flowing through another government entity like a city or a state. So it's important to communicate your development timeline with the Brownfield program you're working with to see if your timelines are compatible. So you want to make sure that they know about any major milestones or deadlines with your development schedule. We can't help if we don't know, and sometimes we can make accommodations or put a little bit more pressure on certain approvals just to get those done quicker. Just to give you an idea of how it impacts the timeline though, if you conducted a phase 1 assessment, which is basically a research report on the property, with private funding, it normally takes about 30 days. With Brownfield funding, it takes more like 60 to 90 days. And for phase 2 assessments, where you're actually collecting soil and groundwater samples and analyzing them to see what's there, the additional Brownfield approvals can add 3 to 6 months to the timeline. So it's a good fit for sites you would like to see addressed down the line, but don't have immediate and very strict deadlines. Community input is a key priority for EPA with Brownfield funding. It's important to involve the neighborhood that will be impacted by the redevelopment. It might be great to bring a historic property back to life, but that could cause unintended consequences for the community, such as increased traffic, parking issues, and gentrification. While these might not be unavoidable, involving the community early on can help generate ideas to help mitigate these impacts and produce a more positive project overall. Sites where EPA has issued an enforcement order, basically requiring someone to clean up a site, are not eligible for Brownfield funding. If the state LDEQ has an enforcement order on the site, it's a really tough sell. An enforcement order is issued when the state or the federal regulatory agency knows a site is contaminated and is requiring someone to clean it up. Be aware, it takes a lot to get to that point. At the state level, LDEQ tries to first work with a responsible party, and if they don't respond, LDEQ then issues a strongly worded, basically, we need you to do something letter before actually issuing the actual enforcement action. So this process normally takes over a year, normally more than that. And if you need help in determining if there's a state enforcement action on your site that you're trying to enroll in a Brownfield program, please let me know, and I can help you navigate the online resources to help figure that out. With limited funding available, another consideration is reuse potential. So how likely is this site to be redeveloped if the environmental issues are addressed? We also kind of want to know how likely is it that there's going to be a return on the investment of Brownfield dollars on this site. This is somewhat of a sliding scale. The farther the site is in the environmental process, the more Brownfield funding that's going to be invested, and the more evidence we would like to see that the redevelopment has a good chance of happening. Things that are taken into consideration include redevelopment plans. Do you know what you want to do with the site once it's cleaned up? Do you just have a general concept, or do you have actual written plans laid out? What other funding sources have been committed to the project? What's the track record of the developer? Do they have a history of moving these sites all the way to development? We can work with sites at all stages of development, but a good candidate for Brownfield funding is going to have a clear vision for the redevelopment and resources either dedicated or in progress to make that happen. Let's talk about the components of the environmental process. Note that these don't necessarily go in a strict order. Sometimes they overlap or they can even circle back around again. But in general, you normally start with a phase 1 environmental site assessment. It's basically a research report put together by an environmental professional that looks at what was at the site previously, what's there now, and what are the environmental concerns with the present and past uses. We're going to talk about this more in a minute as it relates to the liability protections. A phase 2 environmental site assessment is where your environmental consultant will take soil and groundwater samples at a site, analyze them for contamination, and then compare those results to state standards to see if there are any issues that need to be cleaned up. If there is contamination above regulatory standards, then your environmental consultant will develop a cleanup plan to address that contamination. And then finally, the cleanup plan is implemented to remediate the environmental issues at a site. So cleanup for our purposes is addressing the environmental issues at a site to reduce the risk of exposure to people and the environment based on the state's regulatory process. So cleanup can include removing and treating the contamination, or using engineering controls like parking lots to cap the contamination, or employing institutional controls like conveyance notices to prevent exposure. Engineering and institutional controls are options under the LDEQ's voluntary remediation program, and we're going to talk about that more in part 2 of this series. Note, I separated out cleanup planning from executing the cleanup plan, as those fall under different pots of EPA Brownfield funding. And one note about conducting environmental assessments and cleanup work at historic properties. If you're looking at applying for historic tax credits, or the site is located in a historic district, you'll want to keep the State Historic Preservation Office and or the local historic commission in the loop. Normally, the assessment work doesn't really impact the historic integrity of the building, and they don't really have any issues with assessment work, but people or neighbors might call the SHPO or the local historic commission if they see people working at a site. So it's always a good idea to give them a heads up so they're not caught off guard. The cleanup, especially things like asbestos abatement, can impact the structure of the site or involve removing materials from the site. So you just want to make sure that the SHPO is on board with any removal or demolition work that's related to the cleanup. So 2 of the projects I worked on, the Lindy Boggs Medical Center and the Rose Collaborative site, both are historic properties. With the Lindy Boggs Medical Center, the SHPO needed to approve the asbestos abatement activities involved because they involved removing asbestos-containing materials from the site, such as fireproof countertops and fire doors. So the developer sent SHPO the cleanup plan along with their demolition redevelopment plan, so they were in the loop regarding the asbestos abatement. For the Rose Collaborative site, which redeveloped the former St. Rose de Lima Church and school buildings, when we were doing the assessment work, I just gave the SHPO a call before we started, especially because we were going to remove an underground storage tank from the site, just in case someone called them to make sure they were in the loop and not caught off guard. Like I said, normally the environmental work doesn't cause a concern, but it's good to just give them a heads up just in case. As I mentioned before, the Brownfield program created the category of bona fide prospective purchaser. So basically someone who documents what the environmental conditions are at the site before they take ownership to show that they didn't cause or are otherwise responsible for pre-existing contamination. This gives the bona fide prospective purchaser, including any potential funders, liability protection at the state and federal level, and allows them to be eligible for Brownfield cleanup funding if they choose to pursue that. So in order to qualify as a bona fide prospective purchaser, you need to perform what EPA refers to as all appropriate inquiries before taking ownership of a property to document what was there before you owned it. So as I mentioned before, basically it's a research report where the environmental professional is going to look at government records, historic data resources, like aerial photos, fire insurance maps. They'll interview folks that might know something about the history of the site, and they'll also do a site visit to look for signs of potential environmental issues. Then they put together a report that documents what was at the site in the past, what's there now, and what are the recognized environmental conditions, they're commonly called RECs, related to those uses. Most people meet this requirement by performing a Phase 1 environmental site assessment that meets ASTM standard E1527-13. ASTM is an international organization that develops industry standards and how-to guides to meet federal regulations. The E1527 standard is the one that's specific for Phase 1 assessments. It was last updated in 2013, which is where the 13 comes from. It's probably going to be updated again next year, so just be aware of that. So when you're contracting with an environmental professional to do a Phase 1, you want to ask them for one that complies with EPA's all appropriate inquiries and the most current version of ASTM E1527. All right, a few notes on things you should keep in mind regarding all appropriate inquiries and Phase 1 assessments. You do want to make sure your Phase 1 is conducted or overseen by someone that meets the EPA definition of an environmental professional based on their education and or experience. And that link at the bottom will give you more information with what those specifications are. Secondly, everyone who wants to be covered by the liability protection of the Phase 1, they need to be identified as a user in a report. That's a specific term, and there's a section in the report that identifies the user. And they also need to be included in the interview section, where they basically provide whatever information they have on the history of the site. If they don't know anything, they just need to say, I don't know anything about the history of the site. So this includes the prospective purchaser, and we're also seeing that most folks that provide funding to a project also want to be included. Just let your environmental professional know who all the users are up front so they can be included. You can add them later on. They can do like an addendum letter, but that's normally an additional charge and just a general hassle. All right, now for one of my pet peeves. I don't really agree with this language, but EPA's all appropriate inquiries requires the use of this specific statement. This assessment has revealed no evidence of recognized environmental conditions in connection with the property except for the following, and then there's a bulleted list of what your environmental conditions are. Please do not stop reading at no evidence. I've had a lot of people tell me they did a Phase 1 and it came back clean, but when they actually send it over to me, because normally there's a red flag like it used to be a gas station or something else where I'm thinking there's no way that it came back clean. There's actually a long list of environmental issues, but they stopped reading when it said this assessment has revealed no evidence. So please keep reading. It doesn't really matter for liability protection, but it does make a difference when you want to redevelop the site and then are surprised by the environmental issues that came up that were underneath that list, but folks stop reading at the no evidence. Finally, the timing of the Phase 1 is important, and we're going to cover that on the next slide. So in order to be valid for liability protection, the Phase 1 needs to be completed prior to taking ownership of a site. So you're documenting what was there before you took ownership, or in the case of a funder, provided funding to the project. The Phase 1 report is only valid for 1 year, after which you need a new report. And certain parts of the Phase 1 report, like the interviews, the review of government records, the site visit, and searches for environmental cleanup liens, those need to be updated after 180 days. So if you did the Phase 1, let's say in April, but you don't complete the property transaction until December, make sure to update that Phase 1 so it's still valid. It's not unusual to do multiple Phase 1s over the course of a project. For example, one of the sites I worked on, we did a Phase 1 at the beginning of a project for liability protection for a prospective tenant and to figure out what the environmental concerns were so we could develop the sampling plan for the Phase 2. We did another phase one prior to the developer taking actual ownership of the site because more than a year had passed since the original phase one. This also made them eligible for cleanup funding to address the lead, asbestos, and avian fecal matter at the site. And later we did a phase one update to cover the liability concerns for a funder who was contributing to financing to the project because more than 180 days had passed since the previous phase one. Sometimes you need to do these several times over the course of the project. Note that for EPA funding eligibility, EPA uses the date of the report in order to calculate their timeline. They require that if you're requesting cleanup funding, that you have performed a phase one before taking ownership of the site, and they're going to use the date of that report to calculate the timeline. However, for liability protection, some courts have ruled that the clock starts ticking at the start of the investigation. So, for example, when records are requested or a site visit is conducted. Basically, people were holding off completing the reports for several months. I think one of them was over a year in order to coincide with the property transfer deadlines, and the courts decided that didn't really comply with the intention of the law. It's kind of up to you to decide which one you are most comfortable with. Again, there's a link at the bottom of the slide which will give you additional information on EPA's all appropriate inquiries requirements. So that's a general overview of the Brownfields program and the environmental process. As I mentioned before, in part 2, we'll go over how to access Brownfield resources to help you assess and clean up Brownfield sites to facilitate their reuse, and how to collaborate with your local Brownfields program. If you have any questions or would like more information on anything I covered, please feel free to contact me. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to working with you in the future.